Loss is a terrible thing. When you're young, its effects are more potent. May 13th, 1988, 11 minutes before midnight, a thing happened. A thing one would never wish on a child, the loss of a mother. And Fredrick Willow had to suffer in silence. His father had no time to grieve, and his responsibilities took on a new magnitude. Fredrick would watch the dignity leave from his father a little each day. A husk of a man was all that was left after a month. The crippling grip of alcoholism took his father into its grasp. He watched as the man he once loved and worshipped drained away before his eyes. Sturdy working hands shaking in withdrawal. Warm, clear eyes become dark pits of despair. Fredrick laid awake one night. He heard his father's voice coming through the vent. With his ear to it, he listened but made no sense of the words. A loud bang shook his nerves. Taking shelter under his blankets, he then heard the voice of his father calling his name, then screaming it. Kicking the doors open in the hallway, his voice wasn't the familiar voice of his father. It seemed to be a stranger speaking with his vocal cords. There was something about his voice that struck him with horrible fear. The air tasted stale and the colors were muted. Nothing felt right about this night. The loud booms are getting closer. Fearing the worst, he scattered the contents of his nightstand searching for the pocket knife his dad gave him. The oak handle and gold ornaments glinted against his vision. He stood next to the door anticipating death. A shotgun went off 2 rooms down. He felt the sweat precipitating in his palms. He wiped them on his shirt and grasped his knife even tighter. Fredrick heard his father's panting, labored breaths as he cocked the gun and tore another door off the frame. He was then in front of his door. It exploded into splinters and his shotgun came through the threshold, pointing at his pillow. He blew a cloud of feathers in the air that danced to the ground. Fredrick charged his father, slamming the blade in his back. He withdrew the dripping blade from his father while he turned to face him. He looked deep in his eyes and saw the nothingness behind him. His father began to lift his shotgun. Fredrick closed his eyes and plunged the blade deep into his solar plex. His father collapsed lifelessly to the floor. Fredrick cried, holding his dad's head. The ambulance sirens screamed in the distance. The neighbors must have heard the shots. Officers of flashlights and raised guns entered his household, finding Fredrick clutching his father's corpse. The first officer on scene tried to comfort the boy with words and a hand on his shoulder. He eased him away from his father's corpse, hugging him in his embrace. He told him everything was going to be okay and escorted him back to the squad car. Fredrick took another look out the window at the house he called his home. The stains on the floor forever marking the memory of his father, and the day Fredrick changed forever. At the police station, he shook violently beneath the wool blanket. "Hey there, what's your name?" "Fredrick? Nice to meet you. My name is Officer Lawrence. You went through a lot tonight, and I'll be honest with you, there ain't a lot of answers I have for you. I checked out your dad's medical history and, well, I don't know how it happened, but your dad went insane. We found you have family up in New York. We gave a call ahead to your aunt. She should be here to pick you up tomorrow. If you want to sleep, you can do it in my office. Are you hungry? Here, come with me." Fredrick felt his stomach rumble, realizing he hadn't eaten in days. After a couple bags of chips and a stale donut, he fell asleep. The compassion of the officer wasn't lost on him. His sleep was calm and deep. Fredrick had been so emotionally exhausted, he freely accepted this embrace. Upon awaking the next morning, he was presently aware of a coldness in his chest. His dad's toneless, loveless voice returned to him. He remembered something he had heard him say through the vent.
"I have to. I can't let them have him."
Did he mean me? Fredrick thought. One of the many heads visible through the window turned towards him. Officer Lawrence, in a calm tone trying to soothe Fredrick's fears, spoke lightly and direct. "Last night was a lot for anyone to go through. Worse for a kid. You can't let this beat you, son. Your dad was ill. Your aunt is on her way. She seems like a really nice lady. She'll be here within an hour. Let's go get a bite to eat. What you say?" They reached McDonald's right before the breakfast menu switched to lunch. Over sausage McMuffins and pancakes, Officer Lawrence tried to ease the mood a bit. "Your aunt was really pleasant to talk to. She lives in some big property up in New York. I think some of that fresh air and wilderness might do you good, young man." Fredrick has only known the city life. His parents took him camping one year, but this was the extent of his outdoor adventures. His mind took on the daydream of hunting and fishing, climbing trees and running trails. It looped back around to his father and the events of that night. He remembered one phrase in his dad's voice: "Take us home." Lawrence saw the tears forming, and before they could fully take hold, he leaped from his seat, startling Fredrick. "Oh my God, I forgot." "Forgot what?" Fredrick asked. "Ice cream," he replied with a wide smile. They both laughed on the way to pick up their vanilla cones with sprinkles, and once they were back at the station, Lawrence thought the boy had a good taste in ice cream as well. He had a deep sympathy for the boy. He noted his inability to even imagine the boy's mental state. His mom died and he had to kill his own dad? If this doesn't ruin the boy, it'll be a miracle, he thought to himself. The boy's aunt was apparently waiting for them. A large white town car with the driver in front of the door opened it for his aunt. Fredrick never heard of his Aunt Tilly, but he knew her from his dad's side and they didn't communicate much. Besides a few gatherings, he couldn't even place her face or name in his memory. Her opulent clothing spoke of immense wealth. Her voice had notes of the upper class. The reunion was brief, less than 25 minutes, and they were already on their way back to New York. "Fredrick, little nephew of mine, you probably don't remember me, but I saw you when you were a baby. Me and your dad didn't get along that well. We just couldn't see eye to eye. But I've always loved you. I thought I'd never get a chance to express that to you. This is a terrible thing that happened. But Fredrick, believe me, everything happens for a reason. And this too will have its own meaning. It may seem like it don't make sense now, but it will all become clear in time. It's going to be a long ride. What kind of music you listen to?" 11 hours of random stations and the occasional stop for a bathroom break. Fredrick was asleep by the time they made it to the manor, a 3-story Victorian castellet with wrapping greenery framing its bulk. What was meant to be beautiful was more like a stain on the land, a grotesque mockery of beauty, a blasphemy in the dirt in which it sat. Fredrick had a deep emptiness forming in his stomach, like one at the edge of a tall cliff, staring over the precipice, anticipating strong winds to push him over. A servant stood poised at the front gate, leading them down the dual driveway. The car came to a stop in front of the gate. The man at its entrance opened the doors. The smell of the place was pleasant. He tried to keep that thought in his mind instead of the foreboding ones. With the loud clank of the lock, the guard opened the gate. "Come with me, nephew. I'll show you around the property." The next hour was spent leisurely strolling around the gardens and the stone fountain that was the backyard. It all felt wrong, like the place in front of him was a mask. His attention was drawn to the moving curtains on the second floor. Someone had been watching them, he thought. He turned his attention to the gaudy fountain, spraying stale mists into the garden's air. The whole time Aunt Tilly spoke, he didn't hear a single word. She led him inside and up the stairs. Looking down the hall from his perspective, it seemed endless. Dim yellow lights barely lit the space. Dark-colored palettes over canvas occupied the walls, showing the grim, expressionless faces of his lineage. Each step down the hallway showed him a different face looking down at him. He felt the hairs on his neck stand. His first thought entering the room was how much more bigger it was than his whole house. He felt like an insect inside of an antechamber in some damp, dark cavern. The smell of mold assailed his nostrils. A choking fog of dust was kicked up when the door opened. If she said something, he didn't hear her. He sat down on a stiff antique mattress. The sun started to set outside his window. As he was settling and unpacking his belongings, loading the drawers of his inherited dresser, he spotted a desk at the room's window. Inside the desk was an old book. Old tan leather bound its pages. What seemed to him was tree roots, black veins spread across the cover of it in varicose fashion. He felt an intense feeling of shame and disgust just looking at the book. Having never even read its contents, presently the sun was gone from the sky, and its leftover rays colored it with shades of pink and orange. An uncountable amount of stars, more than he's ever been used to, sparkled above the horizon, like thin beams of light leaking from behind a veil. He felt exhausted and overwhelmed by all that has befallen him. Sleep claimed him once more, and within seconds he relaxed stiff on the bed. His dreams weren't peaceful this night. Nightmares were all he had, and most of them were from his father. He saw him as a gray doll, Standing motionless in the dark, glimmering lines of white showed strings attached to his limbs. His lack of awareness and life sickened and disturbed Fredrick, yet he was unable to look away. Dancing fingers appeared above him, pulling on the strings. His body became animated, but still seemed lifeless. The unpredictable jerking of his body resembled stop-motion animation. His father's expression never changed. It was blank. The sound of his screams awoke him. He shot from his prone position to full awareness. He heard clawing and scratching from behind the walls, the chittering sounds of running creatures, the gibbous moon shining its blue shades into his room, casting weird shadows on the wall around him. He saw them as hints of human shapes. That vision solidified from a possibility to a full-spectrum reality. Surrounding his bed were the sentient shadows of the house, red eyes open onto him in their blurry masses. Mixing with the blue light of the moon, it caused the room to take on a purple hue. One of them spoke.
"You are home now, young Fredrick. Read the book."
He screamed and thrashed violently in a convulsion of fear, until he came flying into the room with the fireplace poker cocked behind her head. She dropped it when she realized there was no intruder, and she rushed to her nephew. She held him until he went back silently into slumber, this time dreamlessly, until the sun hit his eyelids. There was no book. A strangeness was instantly apparent to him. There were no birds singing their morning songs, no cicadas, no sound of life in the acres of green around him. The entire property felt of destitute, as if he was abandoned on an island or lost at sea. The dark earth tones of the room seemed unaffected by the sunlight. Only the sound of wind passing through branches could be heard. Another one of his senses was aware of a tasty aroma calling him down to the stairs. He found the kitchen full of cooks and maids moving around in morning chaos, various delectables being cooked and plated. Fredrick thought they were preparing a community feast until he found the dining room empty besides himself and his Aunt Tilly. "Have a seat, nephew. Join me. Breakfast will be ready soon." Crispy bacon filled his nostrils. Steaming stacks of pancakes were placed in front of him. 3 pork sausages made a wall for the syrup moat he poured around his pancakes. Over the forks clinking, his Aunt Tilly asked him questions that fell on deaf ears. Every conversation followed a similar course. For weeks, Fredrick stayed silent while Aunt Tilly got the message slowly. For a month, the silent tension lasted until they couldn't take it anymore, and it all began. Or ended, if you asked Fredrick, with a knock at the door. A pale man with a beak of a nose rapped upon its wood. Aunt Tilly was closest to the door, and she was the one to greet the man. Fredrick peeked between the cigarette-stained blinds. The man stood silent as a corpse and pale as one too. Fredrick started to notice the added amount of lifelessness to the shrubbery. The muted green grass and ugly flowers died in the man's presence. He slowly bent over and placed the book that he'd seen the night before down at her feet. Even these movements to him seemed rigid and forced. A dry, wizened voice spoke with a low crack.
"I apologize. I must leave this to you. I pray you never read its contents."
The man, one step at a time, walked backwards inhumanly fast. When he stood at the tree line, Fredrick watched as shadows consumed his necromantic form. Tilly broke her petrified state, slamming the door and locking it. "Should we call the police?" Fredrick asked. "And say what?" she shouted, apologizing and calling him over to hug him closely. As Fredrick was clutching her, in his peripherals he noticed a new item on the table. His chest felt cold when he noticed the book, with dirt and maggots writhing away from it in fear. They both were shocked into silence. Aunt Tilly, with a hand behind her on Fredrick's chest, slowly approached the book. It was clearly made of human flesh. She recognized tattoo ink on part of its cover. 2 things happened when she opened the book. The room filled with the overwhelming scent of sulfur and ammonia, and Aunt Tilly shook like the book electrocuted her. She fell backwards, stiff as a corpse. Fredrick tried to make himself look as small as he could on the couch. She awoke seconds later, screaming. Suddenly she stopped, never said a word or made eye contact with him or anyone else. She simply got up, walked up the stairs, and slammed the door to her room. The sound startled Fredrick. He felt trapped on that couch, like the floor was the surface of shark-infested waters, and he felt like they were circling in. The hours passed and sunlight faded, as did he. He sunk into a sleep from emotional exhaustion. In his perception, no time passed at all between blinks. A scream tore him from his sleep. Maze discovered that Tilly hung herself, the book at her swinging feet. Fredrick ran like he never ran before, and as the manor shrunk in the distance behind him, he never looked back once. It's been 21 years since that night. He's now 33 and an old drunkard, stumbling from bar to bar after his shifts. He hadn't gotten a single night's sleep since that night without alcohol or drugs. Whenever he did, he'd wake up screaming in cold sweats. As much as he could, he tried to leave it in the past. It called to him on a nightly basis. Visions of the decrepit house flashed across his mind. Sometimes he got so terrified he would close his eyes and see images of the pale man. One day in a drunken stupor he stumbled home, slammed his door shut, locked it and undressed himself, falling into bed. Tonight, even through the alcohol, his nightmares pierced his slumber. In this dream, he was buried up to his shoulders in the dirt, staring up at the house in its current state of dilapidation. In its cobweb-infested cracked windows, beyond a layer of dirt and graffiti, he saw hungry eyes, their motionless forms just staring at him for hours. To him, it felt like days. A faceless man with a slit-for mouth leaned next to his ear. Through putrid black slime, he spoke these words.
Come home.
Fredrick felt the sensation of falling before striking the floor of his apartment. He could smell whiskey leaving his pores, and every breath almost made him gag, until he did spill last night's gas station dinner. One hand on his dresser, he pulled himself up to his feet, sluggishly dragging himself to the bathroom. The man in the mirror was a broken man. Death was his earliest companion, and these visions have grown unbearable. He brewed a coffee laced with Jack Daniels and capped his traveling mug. Sipping away the headache and lessening the groggy burdens, he dragged himself to a bus stop. At the only park in a small town across from him sat two men playing chess and a young lady drawing. His gaze went to go past the young lady. Something brought it back. The movement of her drawing hand was odd and too fast to be accurate, too sporadic to make sense. His curiosity ate away at his nerves. A smile stretched across her face. She looked up at him, and their eye contact was broken by a passing bus. When it did, she was gone. Only the paper she was writing on remained. It was enough to sober his thoughts, and his body became tense. He slowed himself to his feet, crossing the busy street. Cars swerved around him and flipped him off, cussing him out. He never broke his zombified stroll, shambling to the bench. When his hands were touching the weathered wood, he felt a horrible hesitation strike him. He felt like the act of looking at the paper could be irreversibly damaging. Half because he wanted answers, and half because of the strangeness of it all. He did so against his own fear. Scribbled in black, scratchy letters decorated with droplets of blood only read two words.
Come home.
He felt his knees turn to rubber, and it was all he could do to hold himself up. He crumbled the paper in his fist, held it against his forehead, and wept. The two men playing chess got up and decided to take their game elsewhere, leaving him to his own thoughts and dread. Once he gathered up enough will, he forced himself to his feet to walk back home. His day further plunged into madness when he saw a package on his porch. Wrapped in parchment, it was clearly a book, and he didn't have to breach the package to know which one. Instead of more fear, he was filled with anger rising to his chest. He stomped in the direction of the porch and snatched the book from its place. Between the strings holding the parchment closed was an envelope. In flowing cursive letters it said his name, Fredrick. Inside the envelope, in the same style of lettering, only read the address of an old house, and below that the taunting words he was used to by now.
Come home.
Convinced it was a sick joke and tired of living under the grasp of his past, he steeled his nerves, dressed for the journey, called an Uber, and on the 45-minute drive he stared out the window in a trance-like state, trailing the falling rain on his window. His driver attempted conversation but was only met with taciturnity. The only words he heard from the man were the remarks of the broken structure they pulled up to. The driver wasted no time peeling off down the winding driveway. Fredrick stared up at the palace of putrefaction. He felt it staring back. The sun setting behind the manor contrasted the shadows even sharper. The shades were so black one would hallucinate staring into its depths. The familiar cold feeling creeping up his spine gave him a dose of adrenaline. The book in the grocery bag at his side had doubled in weight. There was an unmistakable heaviness to the atmosphere around him. He felt prying eyes staring back from the shadows and primordial whispers from the darkness creeping over the falling daylight. He felt a strange sensation that shadows were chasing away sunlight. Maniacal chattering and low whispers echoed around him in panorama. Every step towards the porch, he felt gravity tightening its hold. The rain suddenly stopped. He looked up and noticed it was only around his property. Walls of rain formed a border around it. His heart lurched up into his chest and his eyes started darting back and forth. Every shadow was given hideous detail. He felt a parody of silence tearing away at his consciousness, and for the first time since he was a kid, he had noticed once more. Not a single life form made itself known on this property, like it was terrified to be noticed. He could scarcely even remember he saw an insect here, and on the porch was an empty, dustless space where the book sat for its first time. He heard a shotgun blast and a flash from the upstairs window caught his attention. Another blast in another window, followed by his father's voice. "Fredrick, you little shit, it's time to join me and Mama. Us together again."
A family.
Another shotgun blast. Fredrick dropped his bag from his hand and let it fall to the wooden planks. Instead of paper and leather sound, the impact was that of a deep bell. Two more to follow. It was all Fredrick could hear. He clutched his ears and fell to his knees. The door creaked open and nothing but shadows were beyond his threshold. The sound faded. He took his hands away from his ears to see bloody palms. Looking back up into the abyss, a gray arm shot forth with bony long clawed fingers, index finger coiling and uncoiling in rhythm.
"Come in. You're home,"
called the demoniac voice from the shadows. The hand in its clammy limb receded into the shadows. Fredrick reached down, peeling the book out of the rain-soaked plastic caked onto it, and chucked the book into the doorway and yelled, "Take your fucking book and fuck this house." Sardonic laughter spilled out of the dark. He instantly regretted his insolence. He scrambled to his feet, trying to break away and do a sprint. He felt fingers like cold steel cables wrap around his ankle. He was snatched into darkness and the door slammed behind him. His screams filled the night, but no one heard them.